Welcome, and thank you for joining today's event, Climate Change in the Great Lakes. In this hour, we'll take a look at the impact of climate change on the lakes and on our region. Our special guests today are Frank Ettawageshik, Executive Director of the United Tribes of Michigan, Sapna Sharma, Associate Professor in the York University Department of Biology, and Gary Whelan, Program Director of the Fisheries Division of the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. Today's conversation will be moderated by Kelly House, Bridge Michigan environmental reporter. This event is in partnership with Circle of Blue and is funded by the Fred A. and Barbara M. Erb Family Foundation and the Bosch Community Fund. Our conversation will begin in just a moment, and Kelly will lead the discussion with our panel for about 40 or 45 minutes, and then we'll turn to your questions. Please type any questions that you have for our panelists into the chat window at any time during today's conversation. As you heard at the very beginning, we are recording today's conversation and it'll be posted on Bridge Michigan's website this week. You can subscribe to our daily or Environment Watch newsletters by visiting www.bridgemi.com and clicking subscribe. Events like this one are made possible by the support of Bridge members. And if you would like to join our membership community, we'll drop a link to do so in the chat during today's conversation. Please stay muted throughout today's conversation. If you have questions for our panelists, as I said, please drop those right into the chat by typing them in. And if you are on the phone and you can't type into the chat function, please email your questions to membership@bridgemi.com. But before we dive into today's conversation, I'd like to pass the virtual microphone to Carl Ganter, who's the co-founder and director of our partner Circle of Blue, for a brief introduction and a very special video scene center for this important conversation.
Well, thanks so much, Amber. And we're really excited to be with you for another important episode in this series and to be working so closely with Bridge and other members of the Great Lakes News Collaborative. And that's also Michigan Radio and Detroit Public Television's Great Lakes Now. And we couldn't be in a more important moment to be talking about climate change and how it will and is affecting the Great Lakes. And recently, the News Collaborative asked important questions like, will the Great Lakes become a climate refuge? And we've seen what happens when poor assumptions set our approach to water access, especially with the drought unfolding in the American West. In fact, I flew Lake Powell a few weeks ago with a documentary crew right around the time when they declared that Lake Powell had reached record low levels. And even my pilot was only half jokingly asking if the Great Lakes would be willing to share their water. And so at Circle of Blue, we're covering these stories across the nation and around the world. And the intersection of climate and water are certainly stories of our time. So in today's session, you'll hear what's happening in the basin and what you can do, and what's the global perspective, and where do the Great Lakes fit? What do policymakers, companies, and listeners need to know? And we have one of the world's leading diplomats for fresh water, and he's co-lead for the UN 2023 Water Conference in March, and that's the first UN conference on water in 40 years. Henk Ovink is Special Envoy for International Water Affairs from the Netherlands. So Henk, thanks so much for being with us today.
It's great to be with you, Carl, today. I'm here in New York for the High-Level Political Forum. The moment we talk about sustainable development, and we put water at the heart of those sustainable development goals, as you know.
So we're here in the Great Lakes, and that's 20% of the world's surface fresh water. Can you put that in context for us, for what you're seeing around the world?
Yeah, good question, Carl. Next year, for the first time in close to 50 years, we have a UN summit on water. And it took so long because we know water is challenging for humans. It is transboundary, touching upon sovereignty issues. So we try to address it in silos. So next year's conference is not, unpacking those silos. And the Great Lakes region has a lot to tell to the world. Lessons learned of the things that went wrong, but also lessons learned on the innovations and best practices that you can show to the world, where the world can take inspiration from, that we can scale and replicate. But that means that whatever you did and want to do has to be put on the agenda. So you have to come, you have to join together, public and private, partners from across the world, to show what you have been doing in this Great Lake regions, and where you say, this is what the world has to listen to, in a sense of be aware, Don't make the same mistakes, but also in the sense of inspiration, try to go this way.
And one last question, Hank, give me a sense of the urgency. How is this playing out around the world? And just give me a sense of the timing here.
It's massive. We fail and lag behind on so many issues. Only close to 1% of the global investments are sustainable and help reduce climate change and help us become more resilient. So that means that we're talking about 99% of everything we do across the world. And we celebrate on the 1%, but we lack the capacity, the will to actually shy away from past practices and vested interests to scale the 1% to 2, 4, 16 and a majority. That is what needs to happen. So we know what works, but it's only a sliver when we think about the investment. Scaling and replicating that is going to be of critical importance. And what we see now across the world are disasters that are only increasing in scale, size, and in time, impacting our environments, our societies, and the most vulnerable first. And if we don't, stick to the 1.5 and make sure that those sustainable development goals are not paper, but practice, then we lose.
So Hank Ovink sets a dynamic scene for perhaps the most active moment in water in history and to the existential threats we face. To bring this back to the Great Lakes, we have an exceptional panel today, and it's moderated by Kelly House, environment reporter from Bridge, Michigan. Over to you, Kelly.
Thanks, Carl, and thanks to our speakers for being here. These three are really experts, and I've turned to each of them multiple times over the past year, as Michigan has had the balmiest October on record last year, delayed ice cover in the Great Lakes. We noticed a lot of flooding that was catastrophic and impacts on fish and wildlife and humans from that. So these are experts in that topic and in what it looks like on Michigan on the ground. So really happy to have you here. I'm going to start with Sapna. You research how climate change looks in our Great Lakes. What are you finding in terms of the raw impacts in the lakes themselves?
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, so I researched the Great Lakes, but also inland lakes around the world. And some common features that we're observing is that lakes are experiencing earlier ice off and later ice on dates, so shorter winter ice cover. We're seeing warmer water temperatures, and we're seeing increased prevalence of algal blooms in many lakes around the world, as well as the Great Lakes. So for example, when we've done some global synthesis projects, Lake Superior tends to stick out as a lake that's changing rapidly. So we found that it was losing ice cover at some of the fastest rates found in the world. So for example, our data sets go back to 1867, and we found that Lake Superior has lost 2 months of ice cover in the past 160 years. In terms of water temperatures, in a 25-year period, the summer water temperatures in Lake Superior have warmed by over 3 degrees Celsius, which was the second fastest warming lake in the world. And we're also seeing algal blooms that have historically been unobserved in the lake. So there's quite a wide gamut of water issues that we're seeing in the Great Lakes in particular.
And obviously, winter ice and snow are such a huge part of Michigan's identity and its economy. One thing I wanted to ask you about, because I remembered the study coming out, you mentioning that there are literally some bays in Michigan that will be ice-free by end of century. Can you touch on that? Because that was really startling to me. And then also, what are the implications for our economy, our culture, our way of life when we think about less ice?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a very wide-ranging question, but I'll try to get to all the points. So in terms of the bays in Lake Michigan, as well as in Lake Superior, we're finding that that they're experiencing no ice cover in some winters in the last 40 years. And if we project under climate change scenarios into the future, if we continue emitting greenhouse gases at our current rates, by the 2060s, these bays will no longer freeze, based on our predictions. And if we mitigate and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we actually see we forecast continual freezing, periodic freezing of these bays. In terms of implications, there's quite a few. Ecologically, when you have no ice cover or you have less ice cover, winter evaporation rates increase. And so with increased evaporation in winter, that can lead to reduced water levels. For example, some small lakes and ponds in the Arctic have already begun to disappear because of increased evaporation rates. As I mentioned, we see warmer water temperatures and changes in habitat for our native cool water and cold water fisheries. Culturally, what we've documented is in warmer winters, you have an increased likelihood of cancellations of recreation events such as ice fishing tournaments, ice skating races. And we also looked across 10 countries around the Northern Hemisphere, and we found that in warmer winters, when ice is less stable or thick, there's increased fatality. So more people fall through the ice. In particular, young people are at highest risk, kids or young teenagers and young adults skating, playing on the ice, or young adults snowmobiling. And we're seeing increased prevalence of fatalities through the ice as well. Economically, that's something that we're kind of working on right now, trying to figure out, well, what does this mean for the local communities? We do know, for example, when an ice fishing tournament is canceled in Minnesota, that can bring up to $1 million into a small town. Economically, that is lost in a year when those tournaments are canceled.
And Gary, you've been involved in issues around fish regulation and research for a long time. And I remember you saying to me once, warmer winter water means warmer summer water, which obviously has big implications for fish that rely on those temperature signals. Can you speak to how the changes that Sapna just mentioned and the other changes that we know are coming are expected to affect fish in Michigan?
Be glad to, and thanks, Kelly, for having me today. Some of the things you should think about when you ponder climate change is that we're going to be seeing much more unstable environmental conditions for aquatic life. Everything from the higher rainfall events on top of snow cover, as we just witnessed in Yellowstone in the last month, those are going to drive, and we're seeing more extreme events in Michigan. Those unstable water conditions mean that fish that are in the tributaries, and many of our Great Lakes fish use tributaries, will be exposed to these unstable events, which means probably some loss in recruitment, some changes in species that can't tolerate extreme changes. The other thing to recognize is that, as I mentioned, fish don't like necessarily unstable conditions. They also all have, and not just fish, but also invertebrates and herps that share aquatic systems, all are cold-blooded, and they all respond to temperature. They all have a very specific temperature ranges that they do well in. And when you exceed those or change those, you will see productivity changes. So for example, lake trout have very cold requirements. They don't like temperatures much above 60 degrees. And if indeed our systems change that go beyond that, we will see reductions in some of those species that require cold waters. We're also going to see pretty dramatic changes in how inland lakes stratify. There'll be more anoxic conditions, particularly in deeper areas in these lakes. They're going to probably stratify stronger. There'll be a lot less buffer for fish to live in from an oxygen perspective. Oxygen is directly related to temperature. So the higher the water temperature, the less oxygen you have. It's an inverse relationship. So indeed, as these water temperatures increase, species that have high oxygen demands are going to drop out, or change in some way. So temperature has multiple effects. It also has effects on the overall ability for the fish to maximize its growth rates and maximize their reproductive rates. All those things are going to change as our climate changes. The one other thing that you need to keep in mind is that it also opens the door for new species. Whether they're invasive or not is perhaps something we can all debate, but it's going to open the door to species whose effects we do not know will be on the rest of the fish community. It could be very deleterious. For example, what we've seen in dry-sided mussels, which are perfectly adapted to our systems, unfortunately, have greatly changed the Great Lakes. It also opens it up for more diseases that we have not seen before that may be right now not an issue, but all of a sudden find their temperature in exact range where they can either replicate in respect of a virus or perhaps operate at its maximum as a bacteria. So the issues are broad ranging, and they really focus on more extreme events that fish will be exposed to in general, and significant climatic effects on how fish operate. And they all require very specific temperatures. And going back to what Sapna said, one of the things that we will see with reductions in ice cover will be changes in lake whitefish and other inshore spawning fish that use reefs that require them to be covered by ice to produce the most number of young. Those habitats will be changed. And we've seen that already in some places where we've seen some reductions that we can't attribute to other reasons at this time. So pretty broad ranging effects. Just always keep in mind, these are cold-blooded organisms and are very, very, very targeted at temperature and dissolved oxygen.
So, whitefish, really important Great Lakes fish, really iconic, something people love to eat. What will these changes mean for anglers, both recreational, commercial, and tribal, and just anyone who eats fish in the Great Lakes? And Frank, I'll start with you for that tribal perspective. I know this is something you think about a lot.
I was muted. My apologies. Thank you, Kelly. I think to understand the tribal perspective on the climate and on the fish, need to understand that when my ancestors reserved fishing rights in the treaties, we didn't go down to the water and look at the water and say, those are our fish. Rather, what we did is we reserved the right to fish. What that meant is we reserved the right to sing for the fish, to dance for the fish, to pray for the fish, but to catch and eat the fish, but basically to have a relationship with fish. So we were reserving the right to have that continued relationship with the fish. And that's an important thing as a base to understand our relationship to the waters, to the fish, to all of the other animals around us. And so given that, there are certain species that we have traditionally, historically, taken advantage of their numbers in the lakes. And for us, that will be quite harmful when some of these go away. If they do, with the warming temperature, we realize that Lake Michigan's real close to being the temperature at which the whitefish will no longer be able to be there and are regularly. And so we're concerned about that. But we realize that relationship with fish is relationship with fish in general. What do we do? How do we deal with this? How do we take care of these fish? And for us, this has been a really important thing, because we take fish commercially, but that's only a small part of actually everything that we do. The bigger part is when we take fish for our individual consumption, not as sports fishermen, but when we're fishing for subsistence fishing, for families taking fish to eat and living close to the land. And that relationship with that fish is we're honoring the fish, but we've got to be careful how to protect those fish as well. So that was the first answer I have for your question, and I'll end there because I know other people have answers as well.
Yeah, Gary, do you have perspective on sort of, the state regulated fishing? I know you've talked to me before about possibly how DNR manages some of these rivers changing as they become maybe less hospitable to some species.
There's simply no doubt about that. We will see shrinkages in the distribution of cold water species. So current trout streams, for example, that are marginal at this time will probably become unsuitable over time for trout. We have a number of those. We have an awful lot of groundwater. We're pretty fortunate in that, particularly in the northern part of our state. We have these deep glacial deposits. And that's going to provide a long-term refuge for a lot of cold water species in those areas. But a lot of the other marginal systems are going to shrink. And what we're going to see are expansions of cool, things like walleye, northern pike, muskies, and warm water species like largemouth bass and smallmouth are sort of in between the two. We're going to see expansions of those fisheries. We're going to see probably shifts in our management towards those. And you talk about the Great Lakes, lake trout the Great Lakes are going to hold on for quite a while. Those are big masses of water. They don't change very fast. But when they do, you're not going to turn them back very easily either. So lake trout will be around for quite a while, but there may be changes in their overall distribution. Same with salmon that we currently have. Our salmon fisheries will probably also change. And we may not get the natural recruitment that we currently get in our streams, particularly for Chinook and coho salmon. So a shift from cold water to cool water probably over time, but there's still fair amounts of the other fisheries, the cold water fisheries, even though they're affected, but their recruitment may be affected, and we may have to intervene stronger from a management perspective to ensure those fisheries remain. In other words, we may have to stock more fish, which, by the way, is very expensive and really not something that's very desirable. We would much rather have self-sustaining wild populations of fish in general.
So that point you just made about groundwater as salvation raises a question for me. I'm not sure if it's the right question for this group, but I'm just going to ask it. We also see more irrigation happening in parts of Michigan, groundwater-based irrigation, as warming happens and crops shift northward. Is there any concern that, the partially climate change driven irrigation will impact that groundwater that right now is sort of serving as a salvation for fish?
This is Frank. I serve on the Water Use Advisory Council for the state. And what we're looking at is the implementation of the interstate compact on bulk groundwater withdrawals and also on diversions of water from the Great Lakes. And this, when you're looking at putting in these high capacity wells, we're talking about those center point irrigation systems largely that you're referring to. They're usually 12-inch wells and they'll pump for like 24 hours at a time. And so the process of the water withdrawal assessment tool that we have for determining who can use wells or not, or how much you can take, largely depends on maintaining a status quo in the rivers and maintaining the temperature in those rivers. And this is based on a sort of a historical experience of the water. What I see right now as a potential issue is that as the climate warms, and perhaps we have more demand on irrigation, and even if we didn't, we may still have the streams maybe warming up and changing the fish and the other organisms that can live there. So we have this double whammy of trying to maintain the use of water in the Great Lakes region, and particularly within this region, as you brought up about irrigation, managing that in a way, but we can't manage it for a status quo of 5 or 10 years ago. We have to realize that that's going to be changing as we move along. So this is a dynamic situation that you ask a question about. There is no specific answer to it other than we have to be paying attention to it.
So I have one more fish question, and then I'll move to other parts of the climate pie. But will we lose any? Oh, Gary, go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up on Frank's comments there, which I think are really important, is that there's been lots of models that are taking a look at human behavior in response to climate change. And almost every one of them shows humans moving north and agriculture moving north, mainly because the temperatures are available. And that means putting crops like row crops on unstable soils that are really not very good for ag in general. There's a good reason why a lot of our states in forest is because of the deep sand soil, which does not make great cropland. In order for you to maintain cropland, you've got to fertilize a lot of it and you've got to pump a whole lot of water to irrigate it. And then you can grow crops economically. And that's one of the things we see are a lot of row crops moving north into these soils that frankly are not very good. And that's going to have the implications that Frank alluded to, high capacity wells. I mean, we're already seeing in southeastern Michigan amongst the highest irrigated places in the United States. And most people don't realize that we're already seeing the migration of irrigation moving into places we have not seen it before, with big implications on fish.
Thank you for that. And I'm curious, could we lose any species altogether? You know, we've heard that whitefish are losing out. Who else are the winners and losers? And could we literally lose any species?
So I can answer some of that, as I've done some fisheries modeling under climate change as well. And in the US, for example, we looked at Cisco populations on the southern edge of their range, and we're finding, so Cisco is a cold water forage fish that lake trout, for example, like to eat. And we're losing those populations because of the warming climates and the oxygen concentrations in the bottom layers declining as well. Up in Ontario, we've been doing keeping track of some of the fisheries up here, and what we're seeing is that warm water fishes that are not native to many of the lakes here, including smallmouth bass, such as smallmouth bass and rock bass, are invading north quite rapidly. And that's contributing to a rapid decline and shift in cold water and cool water forage fish populations. Walleye here are kind of in a risky situation because the temperatures are warming a lot faster than they were previously. And so they're reaching their thermal tolerance. But with the invasion of the smallmouth bass, the bass are out competing walleye for forage, and they're also eating some of the young walleye. So up in Ontario, we're kind of in a dicier situation, I think, because the native cool water and cold water fisheries are really seeing this new competition with bass that are moving north.
Yeah, I'll chime in a bit behind you there, Sapna. There's a few other species to think about. Brook trout are an iconic cold water species. They're going to lose habitat and they're going to contract their range over time. And there's a whole host of other species that most people don't pay any attention to, things like slimy sculpin, which are a very cold water adapted species and really require even colder water in some respects than brook trout do. So those ranges are going to contract. And as Sapna mentioned, walleye is kind of the in-between critter, and so are northern pike. Northern pike really are not a warm water species. They really want to be in cold water to appropriately grow to maximum sizes. Whereas their relative, the muskies like warmer water, and they'll probably invade further and move into other waters where we hadn't considered managing for them in the past. And smallmouth, are going to be winners in this probably, at least in the short term, unless water temperatures really climb. They're going to continue expanding their range across the country and across our landscape here in Michigan as they'll continue moving north. We already have some of the best smallmouth bass fisheries in North America here in Michigan, and they're probably going to get better over time, but it's going to be at the expense of other species, as Sapna mentioned, Cisco and a whole host of white fishes in general. The whole family has got issues with temperature and is going to struggle in the face of warming climate.
What about other species in our region? I'm thinking like birds that rely on fish stocks, or plant life like the wild rice beds that are already pretty hard to find in places where they used to be abundant. And also the flip side of that, more mosquitoes or things that might be more abundant. Can any of you speak to concerns or signs of hope about other Great Lakes species and how they'll fare?
This is Frank, and I'll take a first stab at that in terms of I'm going to talk about trees, for instance. The the maple tree is so important to the native culture that our name for it is Ninatig, meaning our tree. And it's a very important part of our culture. And I've seen projections from the EPA that the current rate of climate change by 2050, the northern Michigan area is no longer going to be the natural habitat for the sugar maple. What does it mean for our people culturally when the tree no longer exists in our area and we have to travel to go to find it? What does that mean because the effects on climate change here are, there's effects on the water temperature, there's effects on air and on migration, but there's also a cultural effect and there's also a mental health effect. What does it mean when the world changes around us so much that it's different than it was, just a decade or so before? What does it mean when it's different for our cultures? And that's true for not only for us, but for generations of sport fishermen who've been fishing one type of fish, and all of a sudden it's not there, and they have to move a couple hundred miles north to find those again. These are things that we have to be aware of and be careful of and be thinking about in terms of if you name the problem, it makes it easier to figure out how to adapt to it or deal with it. But if you're not naming the problem and all you're feeling is the dysfunction about things being different, then you have all sorts of problems within your culture, within your communities and your society. So I think it's important for us to be aware of these changes that are happening around us, and to figure out how we can account for that within our lives.
I'll go ahead and provide some more to Frank. Frank's very, very correct. We're going to see massive changes in our forest composition. A lot of aspen, for example, doesn't fare well in warm temperatures. Most of us are so used to seeing aspen, but there's a whole industry that relies on aspen, for example, for economic sustainability. Much of your pulpwood comes from aspen, for example. And that's going to change. Maple is going to change. Our red pine forests are going to change. What they're going to change to is unclear. That is not a question mark. Who's going to replace them? Or is it going to be replaced by some other human-based agricultural product, which is another very good possibility. But you also mentioned about the birds and fish that are water related. They're also going to change. Those riparian corridors are going to be very different. Cedar is not going to fare as well. A lot of those systems in the north are cedar-based systems. They don't like the warm weather. Hemlocks are going to disappear probably, or at least change as more invasive species move in that like these warmer temperatures. It's going to be a struggle for them also. One thing that is going to probably happen is there'll probably some increase in fish production. It's unclear which species will benefit, but there'll be some increase from warmer temperatures. Species like white suckers will probably increase some. They're temperature generalists. So the species that are generalists are going to increase. That means there could be more food resources for birds and mammals, things like bald eagles and great blue herons and mink and otter that use these species pretty predominantly. So there might be some increases there. So, I mean, that's a slight bright light, but it's not a heck of a lot when you look at the massive changes we'll have to absorb to get to some of those increases in productivity. And indeed, some of those cool water species I mentioned are more productive than cold water species are. It's just bioenergetics hard at work. The warmer the temperature is, the more tissue you can elaborate, as long as you can operate within the temperature range that you're being exposed to.
So we know that, a lot of issues in society are not felt evenly. People who are more vulnerable in various ways, bear more of the pain. Frank just mentioned a piece of that for tribes, this cultural connection to a species that may be disappearing from the place that has historically been. We saw that during last summer's big floods in Metro Detroit. People who didn't have flood insurance obviously had a harder time bouncing back, or if you didn't have a sump pump, your basement may have been flooded worse and for longer. Sapna, I know that you've studied, or at least maybe are currently studying, the uneven sort of toll that climate disruption might take in our region. What are you finding? Who's going to be hit the hardest?
So, I haven't studied it. I'm reading about it. So I haven't done any experiments or interviews or anything. But I am reading a lot about the inequalities in water accessibility, but also thinking about urban heat islands. So, for example, in cities, the poor, marginalized, racialized communities are experiencing higher temperatures than within the same city than a neighborhood that has more trees and older trees and larger canopies. So even just the temperatures that people experience can differ by 10 degrees Celsius in a day, depending on which kind of neighborhood you live in. In terms of water, we're seeing things similarly in Canada, in the US, and around the world. But, thinking about Canada and the US, where we're amongst the richest countries, we have so much water. We have so much fresh water. In Canada, we have 9 million lakes, and Indigenous communities, some Indigenous communities still have boil water advisories, which is unacceptable in 2022. We see, so it's not just in, countries that are further away, it's happening where we live, it's happening in Michigan, it's happening in Ontario. And I think that's something that we obviously have to change. We have to put resources into changing and recognizing that the brunt of climate change is not experienced equally, and it's poor, marginalized communities, racialized communities that may experience worse effects than others.
I feel maybe this is just my Midwestern, bias coming through, but I often feel like when I read big national or global stories about climate change, you're hearing about sea level rise, you're hearing about Western drought. I feel like freshwater lakes and those issues get a little less attention, but that again might just be me. Frank, you attend a lot of international conversations and negotiations around climate. How much are freshwater lakes, and particularly the Great Lakes region, part of the conversation on those big stages?
Well, last summer, leading up to a conference at the UN in the fall on the World Food Summit, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, UNFAO, they sponsored a series of webinars on blue foods. And the blue foods, for the most part, were ocean foods that people were talking about. But there were at least two of us that were involved in Great Lakes. We had some from the African Great Lakes, and also the Great Lakes here, where we were talking about the importance of foods culturally and the importance of the foods as sustainable. Because the food that the fish that are harvested in Michigan, there's a few trophy fish, there's some catch and release, but most of them are eaten, and they become an important part of our food system here. And so there is attention that's being paid, although I have to tell you that I was an afterthought to be on the panel. Somebody said, you need somebody from the Great Lakes on there. Well, that's how I ended up there. And so, but because of that, we were able to make sure we were part of their final report, and that we're part of that. So I do work with that, and then I also do a lot of work on the climate change issues, where we're talking about the impact on, in my case, I'm part of the Indigenous Caucus for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where we're trying to make sure that Indigenous issues are part of the discussion, so that we're not left out or everything's done at our expense. So these are the things that happen internationally in these when we're talking about water and foods, and that whole the issue of access to water is who was speaking about the United Nations, the Sustainable Development Goals, and how that's being implemented, and how access to water is one of those key critical things for people all over the earth. One of the issues that we have here in the Great Lakes is because we have so much water, and I hear about from Canada as well, there's so much water that it's hard for us to convince our populations that water needs to be respected and conserved. They don't understand that even a thimbleful of water, no matter where you are on earth, deserves respect and deserves to be taken care of. And when you have all of this water around us, it's been really hard to get people to understand the importance of conservation and efficiency in water use.
So that's a good segue into another question on my mind. You know, Carl opened with that picture of a really scarily low looking Lake Powell. Our region in some ways has been sort of preparing for the possibility of a thirsty West for a while. You know, our states have signed that compact limiting transfers of water out of the basin, but it's already being tested. There's been some high profile cases in Wisconsin specifically. Frank, I know you were involved in the negotiations there. Do you think that blockade on out of basin transfers will hold up as the pressure grows higher from parts of the world that are getting drier? And Sapna and Gary, feel free to chime in too if you have thoughts on this.
Well, in the negotiation on the Great Lakes Compact, there were 8 states, and then there's an international agreement that includes the 2 Canadian provinces, and that has parallel language. But the Great Lakes Compact, most people here on this call will know that was negotiated over time. It took a long time to get it set up to do it. It got negotiated, and then when it got adopted, it was had to be approved word for word without a change of a comma or a period or anything by 8 state legislatures, which was no easy task. And then once it was done, it had to be approved by the US Congress. So under the US Constitution, an interstate compact that's approved becomes federal law. So the best that we can do is we have made sure that we have this compact between the states, and that is now federal law. And that's the best that we can probably do. Any law can eventually be changed with enough pressure. So we can't rest, as they say, resting on your laurels. You can't sit back and say, oh, well, we got that done. We have to be constantly vigilant to protect these issues. Now, there are issues like the one you're thinking maybe in Wisconsin frankly, the city of Waukesha. But that was something anticipated in the compact, that they would be able to use Great Lakes water, but there were special conditions. It was that debate over those conditions that was there, but it wasn't that we were taking water outside of the basin. So far, we have not had a situation like that, and we're very careful to safeguard the water. I think the bigger issue here is once we're safeguarding our water, though, and I need to mention this. I know our time is limited today, but I want to be sure to mention that issue of migration is going to be a big issue for us. We spent a long time with industry migrating away. Well, they may very well, and in some cases already are migrating back, because this is where the water is. And if they can't move the water, they're going to have to move the industry. And that's also true for people. We have, even within the United States itself, we have populations migrating, like from Puerto Rico to Buffalo, for instance. There's a large Puerto Rican population there now, just with the United States citizens themselves migrating. We're also going to have migration from outside the United States. And this is true just with the US, it's also true for Canada. This area is going to be a magnet for people. So we're going to have to make sure that our zoning laws, our building laws, our environmental laws and regulations are anticipating a significantly larger population in order to protect everything.
Yeah, and I know we, the Great Lakes News Collaborative touched on some of those themes last year, this notion that our region may be a climate haven, but of course, you know, the laws and regulations meant to set up that future may or may not exist. I'm curious, one, you know, given all of the changes we can expect in our region that you all just sort of outlined, is climate haven an accurate term or a misnomer? And then two, you know, what are some of those policy gaps that you see as needing to be filled if we are to anticipate sort of an influx of people and all of the complications that come along with that? Sapna, I'll start with you, and I'm sure everyone probably has thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the policy gaps. I think Gary and Frank are better positioned to answer that question for Michigan. But in terms of a climate haven, I would say no, because the Great Lakes already, the Great Lakes watershed already hosts so many millions and millions of people, millions of residents, and we're seeing such dramatic impact. So, you know, what comes to mind is the Lake Erie algal bloom. I think it was in 2013 that affected the water supply, that shut down the water supply for Toledo, Ohio, and affecting hundreds of thousands of people for several days. So we have more storm events, and in the Great Lakes region itself, like extreme climatic events are expected to become more common with increased storms, with increased heat waves. So I was a little surprised to hear that Michigan and the Great Lakes region is considered a climate haven, because to me, it seems like it's an area with a lot of change and a lot of upcoming extreme climatic events. But Gary and Frank might have a lot to add.
I'll add a couple of things. I want to follow up on some of Frank's comments from the previous question, just very briefly. You know, I'm cautiously optimistic that we have enough legal barriers and policy barriers in place to ensure that we keep our water. However, there's an old saying in water: as the water flows downhill, accept the money. And there is a huge amount of money in the West, and that could make some very interesting changes, either at a national level or literally buying somebody off if necessary to get them to change their viewpoints from an economic perspective. So I'm not as convinced that we are as prepared as I'd like us to be to ensure that we keep our water. I'm cautiously optimistic. But leading back into some of those policy questions, you know, I don't think that Michigan is ready for a massive influx of people as a climate haven. In particular, as our infrastructure is ill prepared. It's frankly barely holds together for what we have today. And we're investing a lot of money in infrastructure to try to keep things like water treatment plants, both wastewater and water as in potable water opportunities, keeping those up and running. We're not really ready from a policy perspective of massive changes in our landscape, particularly as you go north. What that means to water quality from a non-point perspective, which is an area that we're most weak in across the country, at least on the US side. Our non-point policies are not terribly strong. We're pretty good at handling point sources on the whole, but non-point we struggle with. And so indeed, if you have massive influxes of people, and we're already seeing them out running essentially existing infrastructures in highly desirable areas where you have, you know, talk now about, you know, putting in new sewage treatment plants and systems in places that are currently all on septic. Well, we can't have everybody on septic forever, particularly where there's high density populations moving to highly desirable locations without having some degradation from that type of treatment. So that's just one policy area I think we're pretty weak on, frankly. And it'd be interesting to see if that changes with the pressures put on our state, if indeed we are a destination state as a climate haven.
Building on what Gary has said, that in one area that I've been involved in zoning over the years in different ways, and we were doing a study and we felt that we were quite crowded in this particular region that had, I think we had 4,400 buildings, for instance. But when you looked at the zoning law and you realized what the zoning law would allow to be built, if it was fully built out, it was over 40,000 buildings. And so what we've got, everybody wants zoning, but they want it for their neighbor, not for them. And so what happens is that zoning is just one area that controls the density of the population and how long septic fields will hold up versus having to put in sewage treatment plants and all of this. These are the kind of things that we have to think about, because it's not just zoning, for instance, that's part of this issue, but there's a lot of other political issues that come. And while when you think of us as a haven, I would say to Sapna, we have, the problem we have is that with global warming happening and with large areas of the seacoast flooding, there will be a significant migration of people that are going to have to go somewhere. And at this point, we're perceived as a very good place to live. And so there'll be quite a bit of population there, even though for us here, it's getting worse. We're looking at it as, oh my gosh, we have all these problems. But compared to other places that may be underwater or nearly underwater, we're going to look really good to them. I have friends, indigenous friends that live down along the Gulf, whose land has gone from about 4 square miles down to, they have a small island now that is rapidly washing away. And eventually their whole community is going to be gone within a decade or so. And they need to move. Well, they're moving further inland, but there's people there moving further inland yet. And so this is the kind of thing we have to be careful about, have to think about. What is that pressure going to mean for us? And so it raises all kinds of questions, not just about climate regulation and zoning laws and stuff, but it raises issues about how can we in our particular way of dealing with our governance and everything, how can we absorb all of these other folks in a way that will not break our systems down, break them apart? And I think about the agriculture. As the agriculture moves north, the reason it isn't north, I think, Gary, you already said this, I think, is that the best soil's in the south. And as we move north, we get into more poorer and poorer farmland. One of the reasons we have so much state forest in the north is because people homesteaded it, discovered it didn't work, let it go for back taxes, and it became state property. Now it's state forest. Well, that's why it got there. And if we turn around and start thinking we're going to farm this land again, that gets to be a big problem. And it's a big problem for water. That's the thing. It takes so much more water to do this. So water is going to be a key. The whole theme of our thing here is thinking about Great Lakes water. But we can't think about just Great Lakes water without realizing that all the water in this region is connected. It's, all the streams, the springs and the rivers and everything, they flow into the Great Lakes and vice versa. All that snow that falls on the land melts and starts it all over again. So we have to be aware of this. And I don't have answers, but I know that it helps to at least understand what the questions are.
And I want to get to a couple of viewer questions while we still have time. I think we could go on for another hour and still have lots more to talk about. This one's from David Nyberg, who is on the Natural Resources Commission for the state. So he's asking, how can state managers and the Natural Resources Commission best mitigate impacts of climate change to native fisheries through habitat restoration and improvements, regulations, et cetera?
I guess I'll take a shot at that one, Dave, David, just so, because I'll see you tomorrow, actually. So I think that we have started climate changing in earnest, particularly in Fisheries Division. I know other divisions have too. And some of the things you can do is you can resist climate change, at least for some time. You can increase your riparian corridor areas, increase the tree size, increase shading, reduce the amount of solar radiation. At some point, you have to think about, okay, I'm at the end of the line for those sorts of things. Another thing to think about is connectivity. Increasing connectivity both upstream and downstream and to the Great Lakes and laterally into riparian corridors is really important to allow fish to move. Because right now we have about 5,000, well, we have probably closer to about 15,000 barriers in the state of Michigan. That includes road crossings, dams, culverts. It's in that ballpark. I can give you a better number, but it's in that range. It's 5,000 dams, and then there's about, yeah, it's about right, be about 15,000 total. So connectivity is really important. Putting in more, getting rid of things like unneeded dams. So dams and impoundments are large solar collectors. They increase water temperatures. If you took some of those out that didn't have a social or economic purpose, that would help with temperature. There's not a great deal, unfortunately, we can probably do for the Great Lakes directly, except to work on the tributaries and make sure we keep the tributaries as resistant to climate change as possible. I would not suggest that we engineer them necessarily for cold water, but we certainly can make them resistant to warming by that combination I mentioned. But ultimately, there's only so far you can go until those things change on you and you get essentially a different script you have to work from. And you think about having to adapt and think about how you will adapt your resources and your management to dealing with changes in conditions. As I mentioned earlier, marginal trout streams. You'll be able to keep those as trout streams for some period of time. You probably will lose natural recruitment first, and then you'll probably have to maintain stocking for some period of time if you wish to maintain a trout fishery in a particular stream, a small stream, for example. But at some point, that's not going to be sustainable either. If indeed climate continues, you have to think about changing species. And that'll be a difficult management conundrum, is when do you make those changes of decision? But in the meantime, we should resist it as much as we can. And that could be decades that we buy by a good resistance path. I hope that, David, that answers your question and provides you some insights.
I would just add that as we think about adapting, I think we're sort of getting close to the end here. But the thing is that what we can do individually is to do the best we can individually to reduce our footprint, our carbon footprint, to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, to do things that are going to be more environmentally friendly. And it's such a big problem. It's really hard to figure out how not taking the elevator and taking the stairs somewhere is going to affect the climate. But if a lot of people do that, it's less energy use, and the less energy use is less carbon fuels that are put in the air. And that makes a big difference. And not only does it save money and you get healthier as you walk the stairs, but it also helps to lower that carbon footprint. And if we all do that, if everybody does some little bit every day, it'll add up, and it will help us to make this adaptation and this transition as the climate evolves.
Thanks. And I want to very,
Kelly, if I could just, I did miss one key point is, David, one thing I was remiss in mentioning is keeping water on the landscape, and literally keeping it in the streams, keeping it in the lakes, using it wisely, and making sure that we have as natural a hydrograph as we can maintain, which is the natural pattern of water in the system. That's really important.
I want to squeeze in one last question, if Josiah, is that okay? But can we be really quick about it? And I think Frank just touched on it, and Sapna, your research really underscores that, things will be better if we tackle climate quicker. Things will get worse if we take longer or fail to rein in emissions. I'd be interested to hear, one of our readers says, I'd be interested to hear if the panelists have any thoughts about the status and current pace of Michigan's actions to address the climate challenge by reducing emissions. Again, if you can answer quickly, that'd be great.
Real quickly, I think the Michigan Healthy Climate Plan is a really good step forward. And it builds on other plans that have been developed over the last several administrations. But I think that that's a good start. There's a lot of positive steps in there if we were to follow that.
And I'll leave it at that with Frank, because I know we are right at 1. I'll kick it to my colleague, Josiah Foster. Thank you to all three of you for sharing some of your insights and expertise today.
All right. I want to thank you all so much for joining us. I want to thank you, Frank, Gary, Sapna, and I even want to thank our moderator, Kelly House, and our partner from the Circle of Blue. I just want to give a special thank you to the Fred and Barbara M. Erb Family Foundation and the Bosch Community Fund for their sponsorship of this event series. I want to remind you that we will be posting this recording in Bridge, Michigan. So wherever you get your Bridge, Michigan news, you should see this recording either this week or next week. I want to announce that we'll be resuming this bi-monthly series in September with the announcement coming real soon. I want to thank you again for spending an hour out of your day to join us, and have a great day.